The first witness is unnamed, and we're going to be asking the press, firstly, not to mention her name, but secondly, not to or photograph her. She's a witness that deals with criminals, and she wants to tell the public her story. She believes it's in the public interest to tell the story, but she does not want her photograph in the newspapers or on television.
And neither her name or her photograph?
Neither her name nor her photograph.
Well, you know, I can make a direction to that effect, and I do make a direction to that effect. But of course, if there's someone unscrupulous who then just publishes it in any event, well, then the cat's out of the bag. But I would really request cooperation on that. I mean, these witnesses that you hear, a lot of them come and give evidence under lots of anxiety. And they do it because they say they want they want the public to know this is their institution. They want to know what's happening. So please, would you cooperate with that? And the cameraman, would you please not film her at all? Is it okay? Guys, thanks very much. And I know you've got cell phones that can take pictures. Please don't. Thank you. And don't publish her name either.
This afternoon on the schedule is Mr. Hlengani Matabula, who is the Chief Officer for Governance, International Relations, Strategy and Communications at SARS. He had come to the Commission asking to present his testimony, and the reason that I had scheduled him this afternoon, Judge, was because his name is going to come up a few times this morning, and it would have been appropriate for him to then give his testimony in response, in part, to some of what will come up this morning. I was told after yesterday's hearing that he's no longer available to come today. So there is now no witness scheduled this afternoon. I did send a message to Mr. Matabula that he can come later in the week, we'll fit him in, or at the next hearing.
Thank you.
I call the first witness.
Can someone, oh there. Thanks very much. Sit down, please. Will you affirm that the evidence you give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? If so, will you say, I do?
I do.
Morning, ma'am. Thank you for coming. Good morning. I think it's best to introduce you as a member of SARS's anti-corruption structure.
That's correct.
And your work for some years has been focused on internal corruption in SARS.
Yes.
You have given me, is there a problem with the cameras? No. You have given me not only your testimony, but a range of documents that accompany it. And I think your evidence would best be told in the narrative form in which you presented it in your submission. So I ask you to kick off.
Okay. So I want to start talking to the anti-corruption journey in SARS in 2008, 20 January 2008. And I start there because it is at that point when Praveen Gordhan was still the commissioner of SARS that the Anti-Corruption and Security Unit was set up. So at the time, in 2008, the structure of anti-corruption within SARS was decentralized. And a motivation was put down to centralize the structure. And the reasons put forward at the time for the centralization of one big anti-corruption and security structure included reasons like a lack of synergy between the different security units, continuous change management within the various units, the fact that these units were continuously in crisis mode. So instead of being proactive, they were just reactive continuously. So those were among the reasons that were put forward to create the Anti-Corruption and Security Unit, and it was then approved on 20 January 2008. And I start the story there because currently we now have also a decentralized model, and the same problems that were put down at the time are now emerging. So for example, there's a complete lack of synergy between the different security units within SARS, and we struggle on an annual basis to report to the AG on SARS's fraud prevention plan, which is a requirement of the PFMA. So because every business unit, the different units, whether it's physical security, vetting, screening, the investigations component, we all run our own business plans. And there isn't coordination in terms of a fraud prevention plan for SARS. There's no coordination thereof. And so we struggle with the synergy, and we struggle with the reporting to the AG. From there, so the Anti-Corruption and Security Unit called ACAS was set up. In July 2010, there was a peer review done by the DPSA at the time. And in this peer review, basically...
Who's DPSA?
DPSA, yes. Department of Public Service and Administration. So the Department of Public Service and Administration did a compliance audit to establish whether the minimum anti-corruption capability in the different government departments in fact existed, and if it existed, to what degree did it exist. So we as SARS, we participated in this peer review or compliance audit done by the DPSA, and we came out tops. We were the best performing anti-corruption unit in government at the time. Out of a total of 85 government departments, we received the highest score, being 87%. That was our score.
Yes, and I have that document, ma'am.
Then in 2013, again, another compliance audit or peer review was done, again by the Department of Public Service and Administration, but this time focused specifically on the JCPS cluster, the joint, it's the policing, security policing cluster. So they focused on the departments within the policing and criminal justice environment. And it was part of sort of a decision by the anti-corruption task team of government to do such a review of the JCPS cluster departments. Again, SARS participated, and again, at this time they didn't rank the departments, but they measured us, ranging from excellent to high to moderate to low. On every aspect that we were measured on, for example, leadership commitment, we received excellent. Custodianship, high. These are aspects of anti-corruption, so the ability of a department to combat corruption. So different measures. In each and every measure, we received a ranking or rating of high to excellent, nothing below high or excellent. And most of the recommendations in the document really talk about do more of what you are doing, so keep doing what you're doing. And the only thing that they said we should create better coordination was between ourselves, ACAS, the Anti-Corruption and Security Unit, and a new unit that had been created within stakeholder management called Integrity Promotion. So they were actually saying you need to coordinate better between integrity promotion and the ACAS structure. So again, emphasizing the need for coordination and synergy. Those were really the only recommendations made.
And Judge, that report was published on the 2nd of May 2013.
So then in December 2014, 18 December 2014, a newsflash went out to SARS staff, which was issued by then Commissioner Moyane. And the newsflash was entitled Organizational Realignment to Strengthen Capacity. In the communication, the Commissioner indicates that internal investigations, declarations and vetting, as well as security and protection functions will be repositioned. And I'm quoting now from the news flashes. It says, to allow for better alignment and integration, and will contribute to improved capacity and efficiency for SARS by having those functions and activities integrated and positioned in the business areas where they fit best with relevant functional expertise. So the communication now outlines new reporting lines. So in effect, the ACAS structure is disbanded. And the separate units were then put into, whether it be HR or facilities or office of the commissioner. My team went into enforcement. So we were broken up and put into the different business areas. So what for me is something remarkable is that a structure that had been assessed as having high to excellent anti-corruption capability just a year back is now said to require realignment and needs to improve its capacity and efficiency by disbanding the separate unit. So for me, the question is, what was the real reason for realignment? Because we had participated in 2 government peer reviews, 2010 and 2013, which showed us to be a very strong anti-corruption capability, but now there was a decision stating that we need more efficiency and more, for better realignment, we must now be disbanded and put into different areas of SARS, so back to the decentralized model. So on the 31st of December 2014, just before the year ended, emails were sent out by Takalani Musekwa from HR on behalf of the Chief Officer of HR to each one of the managers of the anti-corruption structure of the different teams. And in that communication or emails, the new reporting lines as from the 2nd of January 2015 were outlined. What is also interesting is in this email, the email states to each one of us, so I also received such an email, that the changes are for the interim period pending the overall operating model review. So again, my question to this decision is, why were these changes effected at this stage with such urgency when the new operating model was coming? So a new operating model is already being planned, it's underway, but for some reason there's an urgency to actually restructure this particular unit, the anti-corruption unit, now with urgency. So then in April 2016, the new operating model kicks in. And in terms of the new operating model, our structure was now called, or the investigations component of anti-corruption, where I was now called fraud investigations. And it consisted of internal investigations, risk analysis, and forensic audit. And the new structure was now said to report to the GE internal audit. So that was the new operating model restructuring. We now report to internal audit. On the 18th of April 2016, I attended a meeting. At that stage, I was acting executive. I was requested to act as the executive of this new component called fraud investigations, while we were transitioning into the new operating model. I acted in that position for 3 months. During that time, in April, I attended a meeting with the GE of Internal Audit and other executives of Internal Audit. It was a question and answer session at Hilton House, hosted by Bain and the members of the new operating model steering committee. During that meeting, I asked Ronald Makomva, who was heading the whole new operating model steering committee on the SARS side, to advise on the reason for the placement of fraud investigations in internal audit. And when I asked him that question, he said to me, "Where would you place it?" Which was really shocking, a shocking comment from my point of view, because I believed that Bain and Company had been paid a hell of a lot of money, and I assumed that they were implementing best practice and that they had done benchmarking in terms of best practice, and therefore the placement of ourselves within internal audit should have had something to do with a best practice. Instead, I was asked, "Where would you place it?" So, in essence, in that meeting, it was made clear that this meeting was not about a discussion of why the operating model had placed certain functions where they had placed us. We just had to accept it, and we left the meeting. So we still felt that the placement of the fraud investigations component, which is basically internal investigations, was incorrect under internal audit. And the reasons for that is that we felt that the lines of defense, when you look at risk or the risk model that SARS used, at that time SARS was using the 3 lines of defense. So internal audit is the 3rd line of defense. Ourselves, we are 1st line of defense. Ourselves, we should also be audited by internal audit. They are the 3rd line of defense. So in our view, this mixing of the lines of defense is incorrect and should not be done. And we made such a submission to the new operating model steering committee. We actually made various submissions. The one submission was to say that we believe that our internal investigations should be an independent structure reporting to the head of the organization, that by placing us within internal audit, you are mixing lines of defense and therefore creating a problem for the function and responsibility of internal audit. We also made a submission to say that our name should not be fraud investigations because it created confusion. In that there's another unit within SARS called criminal investigations who also looks at tax fraud. So people no longer understood us to be an anti-corruption capability. And later on it emerged that many people would actually tell me in person that they thought the anti-corruption capability no longer existed because the name just didn't explain us or explain our work. So we also put in a submission to say our name should change to internal investigations to be able to properly describe what we do. And then we made other submissions relating to reporting lines which were incorrect. All our submissions, if I go to, so on the 16th of May 2016, the outcome of our submissions was communicated via email by the GE internal audit. Let me also say that the GE internal audit at that stage supported us. She was also in agreement that we didn't fit structurally within internal audit. She also supported the idea that it was messing with the lines of defense. So she had also signed off on those submissions that we had made, including the one for name change and the reporting lines. But on the 16th of May 2016, the outcome from the new operating model to all our submissions was that they were not approved. They were all declined. So everything from the request for independence, to the request for name change and the reporting lines were declined by the operating model, and we continued to transition into internal audit. And then on the 13th of July 2016, as the acting executive at the time for fraud investigations, I received an email from the acting GE internal audit, which was actually, she was informing me of a letter that had been issued to my colleague Yusuf Denat, where he was informed that the position, let me maybe halt there and say that during with the onset of the operating model, some members of SARS were affected. Affected meant that your job role no longer exists in the new operating model, and then you are required to apply for positions in the new operating model. So Yusuf Denat was affected. I was not affected. To be honest, I was quite shocked that I wasn't affected. The reason being that Bain never interviewed me. I was never interviewed by Bain. I was never asked what my unit does. And I felt that by not having been interviewed, it meant that they don't actually understand what I do. Yusuf, on the other hand, had been interviewed by Bain and Company. He had been given an audience by them, but somehow he ended up being affected, and I was not affected. So in the process of him now having to apply, and let me say he was a senior manager of internal investigations at the time, and in the new operating model there were 2 senior manager internal investigations roles available. Other people were, when that situation happened, other people were informed that they should choose one of the senior manager roles. You were given a choice. So if there was more than one role that was similar to what you did previously, you would be given a choice. But he wasn't given a choice. He was made affected. He applied for the one of the senior manager roles within fraud investigations. And in this letter that I was sent by the then acting GE internal audit, the letter to him said that all positions within fraud investigations had been put on hold, as well as, all positions and appointments had been put on hold. And the letter also indicated that the operating model steering committee, and the SARS commissioner were reviewing the scope and mandate of fraud investigations. So just to summarize, we are supposed to be transitioning into internal audit. We've made submissions to say we don't belong in internal audit. It was declined. Suddenly there's a change of mind, and Yusuf is being informed in a letter that the position he has applied for and all other positions within fraud investigations are on hold because the steering committee and the SARS commissioner are reviewing the scope and mandate of fraud investigations. So the very next day, as the management of fraud investigations, led by myself as the acting executive, we put together another submission because we could see now that we felt that we need to give input in terms of where we should be placed. And we can see there's some reconsideration, and we are concerned that we are not being called in and asked any input. So we decide to proactively put together a submission ourselves. And the reason for this was we felt, let's put a submission, let's give it to the GE internal audit, so that when she gets called in to these reviews of our scope and mandate, she's empowered, and she also, our voice is also part of her input. So by now we realize that it seems the idea of being independent is not flying because it was declined. Now there's a question about internal audit. So again, we make a submission, and this time we give 2 options. or our input speaks to two options. One where we're still proposing independence, independently reporting to the head of the organization as the best practice from our point of view. And then we give a second option, which is we propose that when we should be put in a risk division. And we provide the GE internal audit with these inputs so that she can use them in her engagements. About a week later, on the 21st of July 2016, Ronald Makomva, who was heading the operating model side from SARS, he asked to meet with me. And now, unlike the previous meeting where I had met him, where he was really not interested in having a discussion with me around the placement of the structure, he now seems quite willing to have a discussion about the placement of fraud investigations. So then he indicates during this meeting to me that he actually used a document that was compiled by the Association for Certified Fraud Examiners, ACFE, entitled Benchmarking Your In-House Fraud Investigation Team. And he used this document to decide that our best placement is within internal audit. He later sent me the document, which I went through. First, let me say that the ACFE, or the Association for Certified Fraud Examiners, is a professional body for fraud investigators. Secondly, the document is actually a survey. It's a survey that was done among members of the ACFE. So if at best, it's common practice, not best practice. So it's a survey of what is the common practice. And when you look at that survey, it says, in terms of the members of the ACFE, most of their structures report into internal audit. But when you go to government departments only, you would see there that they report to the heads of the organization, the majority report there. That aside, I still feel that this is not a best practice benchmark. If you really wanted to do a best practice benchmark, you pick the best anti-corruption capabilities in the industry that you work in. So we have relationships with the Australian Tax Office, Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs. Why did we not go to another revenue agency and actually benchmark with them and from there determine what is the best placement of this structure within the organization?
If I can just stop you for a moment, ma'am. If it's not entirely apparent, my understanding, and you must tell me if I'm correct, is that the reason the placement of any internal corruption unit is so important is because this is the unit that exists in order to check on the rest of the organization to see that it isn't corrupt. Now, if it's placed in the heart of the very organization that it is supposed to be policing, then structurally it will be compromised.
Yes.
So best practice, and I have looked at the Australians and others, best practice is to put this unit outside of the daily operating of the tax authority with a direct line to the head, so that if you become aware of malfeasance in the organization, you don't have to tell somebody who might be involved in that malfeasance of the problem. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's correct. So it's crucial in any anti-corruption capability investigations, internal investigation capabilities, independence, and to be able to actually investigate anybody without fear or favor, you need that independence and you need that reporting line to the head of the organization.
So if you placed in internal audit, for example, and the head of internal audit is himself or herself involved in fraud or corruption, then you have a problem.
Yes. So I also looked at the Australian tax organisation's structure, and they have both internal audit and the internal investigations capability sitting independently of each other and independently of the rest of the organisation, reporting to the head of the organisation. And let me also say that the former anti-corruption and security structure, the ACAS structure, reported to the Deputy Commissioner, but we don't have a Deputy Commissioner in the new operating model. So we reported to the Deputy Commissioner, who reported to the Commissioner.
Thank you. Please go on.
So on the 1st of September, okay, just a recap. There's now, Ronald was basically called to explain why he put us in internal audit. He's now gives me this ACFE document. We give our input to the GE internal audit who we're reporting to. I also share the same submission that I shared with the GE internal with Ronald. And then on the 1st of September 2016, I get an email from my colleague Yusuf Denat, where he informs us. The email is sent to all the members of fraud investigations, and it CCs the acting GE internal audit at the time, and he informs us that we are now reporting. So our reporting line has changed. He's informing us. We now report to the Chief Officer, Strategy and Communication, and that a meeting will be set up by the new Chief Officer to address all members. So let me say that the Chief Officer, Strategy and Communication was responsible for risk as well in the organization. The promised meeting with all staff members never takes place, but on the 22nd of September 2016, the Chief Officer, Strategy and Communication, Mr. Shlengani Matebula, calls a meeting with the management of fraud investigations, HR, and other members of his office. During this, invited to this meeting was also Yegan Mandi, but he did not attend. Yegan Mandi was an investigator in our environment, and at that stage, when this meeting took place, he had been transferred to the office of the Commissioner. So he was also an invitee. We didn't know why, because only managers were invited from our side, but he was also invited.
What was his position in the office of the Commissioner at that stage? Do you know?
I don't know what position he held, but in that meeting, during the meeting, so when I came to the meeting, I didn't know what position he's holding in the office of the Commissioner. But in the meeting, I discovered that he was now holding a senior manager role. And I discovered this because Yusuf Denat, who was in the meeting, my colleague, asked the question of the chair, Shlengani Matebula. He asked for clarification on the issue that he had been told that Yegan Mandi is now a senior manager or acting in a senior manager role, and that this box, I use the term box, which actually belonged to our structure, had now been moved to the office of the Commissioner for him to act in this senior manager role. I'd like to note that Yegan Mandi had no managers reporting to him. So he was now acting in a senior manager role, apparently, according to what I discovered in this meeting, with about 5 members reporting to him, ranging from grade 4A up to 6. There was no managers reporting to him. And when Yusuf asked in the meeting for clarity from the chair, Shlengani Matebula, for the reasons why, or why is this person now a senior manager, we were told by Shlengani that it was the Commissioner's decision. That was it.
My understanding is that before he was made senior manager in the Commissioner's office, he wasn't even a manager.
He
That
wasn't.
He'd leapfrogged a couple of rungs.
Yes, he was a grade 6 operational specialist investigations, which is an investigator. And the senior manager role is a grade 8. So he had jumped 7 to 8. And was now acting in this position with no managers or anything reporting to him. At this meeting that Shlengani called on the 22nd of September, we were also told that we will report to Mandisa Mbekeni, who is the executive in the office of the Chief Officer, Strategy and Communications. So the reporting line now to her was confirmed in that meeting. So in November, 29 November 2016, or around about the last week of November, I'm not 100% sure of the exact date, but the last week of November 2016, again, myself and Yusuf Denat, who were senior managers in the fraud investigations environment, we were called to a meeting by Mandisa Mbekeni, who we were reporting to, our executive at the time, and Zanele Zamkaka, who's with HR business partner. So in this meeting that we were called to by Mandisa and Zanele, we were informed that this tobacco task team, now the tobacco task team includes Gobi Makanya, Yegan Mandi, Deirdre Razak, Pia Smith, David Pillay, Lesecha Ledwaba, and Andries Ntole, that this team, which was in the office of the commissioner, are now going to be co-located with us. So they're not part of us, but they are going to sit there. They're going to be co-located with us. We were very uncomfortable. We pushed back because just a week or so before that, there was a newspaper article talking about this unit and indicating that the unit is investigating cigarette smuggling. So we asked questions like, what type of cases are they dealing with? Where do their cases come from? What governance process does this team have in terms of determining which cases they investigate? And then how does this fit with us? Why do they need to sit with us? Because we are internal investigations. We don't investigate cigarettes. That is external investigation. Well, actually, it's criminal investigations mandate. And the newspaper had even referred to them as the new rogue unit. And that also made us very uncomfortable because as ACAS, the first mention of a rogue unit, we were living with this reputational branding, bad reputational branding, because the confusion in the media that the assets of the rogue unit were our assets, and then people within the organization believed that we were the rogue unit, or we are a rogue unit. So we also raised this, myself and Yusuf, in the meeting to say we have a reputational risk that we are trying to deal with. We even listed it in our risk register as something we must manage. Our reputation has been tarnished very badly and we need to work on this. Now you want to co-locate the newly branded rogue unit, as the media has branded them, with us. So how are we going to fix our reputation if you do this? Nonetheless, our pushback and comments they fell on deaf ears, and Zanele even accused me of being unfair in terms of how the fact that I'm now saying this unit is rogue. To which I responded that if they are as innocent as we are, then I do feel sorry for them. But my concern is about the reputation of our unit, which we're already suffering from media reports and from the view of people within the organization. So another aspect of an anti-corruption unit is trust. You must be trustworthy so that people can come forward and report fraud and corruption. So if you lack that trust, they won't come forward. And now we are struggling with the reputation, and they are deciding to co-locate us with this unit that is called Tobacco Task Team.
Sorry, was there ever an explanation as to why it was considered necessary to co-locate that task unit with your team? Was it just a case of space? What drove the co-location?
It was never explained. It was not explained. I think this is my analysis, is that they needed to create distance between this unit and the office of the commissioner, because now there was media attention to it, which was giving the commissioner's office a negative view. So they needed to create distance. So by co-locating with us, they would then say, no, they're not in the office of the commissioner, they're there in internal investigations.
But they were not changing the reporting line, it's still reported to the commissioner.
Not at this stage, but soon thereafter, then the reporting line changed. So it was like step one, co-location, and then later, step two, you are one.
What I'm trying to understand is, if I'm wrong, help me. I thought that it was already reporting to the commissioner through the gentleman, I think is Yeg and Mondi.
Yes.
And then it was what was now being sought to be done is to co-locate it without changing the reporting line. Unless you're saying that, in fact, it had never, at that point of the engagement around the co-location, there had never been a reporting line to the commissioner.
To be honest, Mr. Kashla, I actually don't know the tobacco task team inner reporting lines. You know, where like at this stage, Gopi Makanya was already there, and later he was more senior to Yegan Mandi. So I don't know how the reporting worked. The documents I've seen around their instructions to operate are actually signed off by Shlengani Matebula, who was also our chief officer at the time. So how that whole thing worked, I don't know the inner workings of the reporting lines and when it changed and when. What I know is that at this stage that we were told we are co-located.
Okay.
Am I interrupting you?
No, go ahead.
Sorry, throughout this period, ma'am, the beginning of the period that you spoke to us about, it was a very successful unit, well-rated, peer reviews, everything. Then all these changes took place. How did that impact on your operations, your performance? What happened to the performance of the unit in fact?
It did. It had a severe impact. One was even the types of cases that we were doing. We moved from working on syndicates, syndicates that operated outside of SARS together with corrupt officials in SARS, to what I would describe as rats and mice cases, behavioral issues, fraudulent sick leave notes. So we moved from investigating syndicated crime to investigating small sick leave note fraud, kilometer claims. That was the one impact. The other impact was the number of reporting. The reporting of cases to us dropped. So people were just not aware that we still existed, in terms of that we were still an anti-corruption internal investigations capability. That also dropped. So the volume of reporting that we had dropped, and the types of cases that we were doing dropped. And then the morale of the whole team was really broken, because it was as if you are never landing. You are being pushed from pillar to post. There's no champion of anti-corruption in the organization who's championing the work of anti-corruption. So the morale was just at its lowest.
So would you say then that corruption increased? That you were a brake against corruption, the brake removed, and therefore corruption increased?
I would definitely say that we were not combating corruption with the same strength and capability that we had done in the past. If syndicates were operating, we were no longer getting those cases, we were not investigating them, and if you understand SARS, it's a bank. It's probably the biggest bank in Africa. The amount of money that goes through the SARS accounts, it's huge, trillions that pass through. So it's not as if syndicates will stop targeting those accounts. It's a constant, you're constantly under threat because money is going through like a bank. And the moment you're not even aware of the existence of those syndicates, then, and you have an internal capability which actually has the skills and experience to deal with syndicated crime. And let me say that recently, in a judgment by Judge Potterell in a procurement fraud matter that we dealt with, where we received very harsh sentences for the syndicate involved in that procurement fraud, she actually stated in her judgment that she was surprised to see that there is an anti-corruption, or was an anti-corruption capability in SARS. And after having done that case, she realized how important it is to have such a capability within a revenue service. Because if it wasn't for that capability, that syndicate, the procurement fraud one, would have never come to light.
Sorry, so one last question in this vein. The effective performance of this vital function by you, when that was reduced, was it placed with anyone else, or did that function really cease?
It ceased.
Well, I think we can say that the Tobacco Task Team, notwithstanding its name, conducted some internal investigations on SARS employees. Is that correct?
They did. And they used the umbrella of cigarette smuggling, a cigarette smuggling project, as their mandate to investigate internal employees. But if you go into any of those cases, none of them actually deal with the Tobacco Task Team, or none of them deal with their suspects being part of big syndicated cigarette smuggling. In fact, a lot of them were addressed on behavioral issues, which had nothing to do with cigarette smuggling. So I would still say that the capability to fight corruption, as much as Tobacco Task Team was investigating some internal stuff, was not at the level at which we were operating at prior.
Well, perhaps you should tell the Commission about the internal memo that you recently sent to the Acting Commissioner about the Tobacco Task Team.
So, April of this year, 2018, I was again made acting executive of the Fraud Investigations Unit. And one of the first things I did was to review the cases that the Tobacco Task Team were doing. The reason for my conducting of the review was that their cases were not registered. They didn't go through the SARS case governance process, the case governance process that fraud investigations is required to go through. So in SARS cases, there's a separation between who evaluates a case and determines that it needs to be investigated and who investigates. So their cases were not registered. They hadn't gone through a case governance process. And by the time I did the review, most of them were already in a disciplinary stage. They were already within the employee relations space.
Sorry, you mean the members?
No, the cases that they dealt with were already at a disciplinary stage. So they'd never gone through registration, they hadn't followed the normal SARS governance process, and they already were at disciplinary stage. Those cases, they used this approval, a memo that was approved by Chief Officer Strategy and Communication Hlengani Mathebula around cigarette smuggling. They used that umbrella project to then investigate and take disciplinary action against a number of internal staff members. And the types of things they dealt with were really behavioral issues that these staff members apparently, that type of misconduct, behavioral type misconduct, and they took disciplinary action around that. So I did not see from those cases that they were really cracking down on cigarette smuggling, and that these members, internal members that they had now taken action against, were, corrupt internal people working with syndicates, cigarette smuggling syndicates outside.
So what would have been these behavioral issues? I mean, you've already clarified that they had nothing to do with participation or involvement with syndicates.
Yes.
What would they have been then?
So in the one, there was an issue of an altercation that occurred between a complainant in the cigarette smuggling industry and an internal employee when the complainant had come forward to report, to lodge a complaint with us. It ended up in an altercation. So that altercation was an investigation. And then there was issues around leaking of information to private investigation companies, where it was unclear whether this was really leaking or they were running joint operations with the private investigation company. So those were the nature of the allegations that had ended up in disciplinary.
But none of these were considered to fit the rats and mice category that should have been dealt with by your unit.
It should have been dealt with by us. I agree with you. I'm still do not understand how, because it was our mandate to conduct internal investigations. So if they had picked up these kinds of contraventions, misconduct, they should have been referred to us to investigate and deal with through the normal case governance process. In instances like the altercation, to be honest, is not actually our mandate at all, because our mandate is internal fraud, internal corruption, serious misconduct, theft. So behavioral things, leaking of information would fit our mandate, but altercations is a HR issue, it's a line management issue. That should have been dealt with by line management, HR.
I just need some clarity. I'm a bit confused about the role that that unit was playing. the unit which conducted investigations into cigarette smuggling. Were they investigating taxpayers or people in the cigarette industry who were smuggling tobacco, or were they investigating the SARS investigators who were doing the work, who were conducting investigations into the cigarette smuggling?
From my review, they were investigating internal staff, which included the SARS investigators who were investigating cigarette smuggling. So I didn't see any cases where that were registered where they were investigating taxpayers. It was the focus was on internal staff, and in particular, those people internally who were dealing with cigarette smuggling investigations.
Okay. And secondly, you said that the types of cases that you used to investigate, they were watered down. What happened to the cases that the cases that you were busy with at the time when you were moved to internal audit? Did somebody else continue with the investigation of those internal corruption cases?
No, we finalized all the cases. We finalized our cases, so we continued.
Okay.
But what I was trying to explain is the types of cases we were receiving. So new cases that were coming in were not at the same level of reporting of syndicated crime as we had been receiving in the past. So the number of reporting and the severity of what was being reported changed and was watered down.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, I need to just follow up on what Advocate Marcelo had raised earlier. If this tobacco task team was investigating other employees who were involved in investigating the illicit tobacco industry, are you suggesting that there in fact had been a case where there were a number of other units that were focused on investigating the same thing? I'm trying to understand how did it come about that they were falling onto each other if it was very clear that there was just this one task team, the tobacco task team, that was focused on the tobacco, where the other units focused on investigating the illicit trade in relation to the tobacco industry?
With the onset of the new operating model, a lot of those other units that did investigate, like your illicit economies, which included cigarette smuggling, no longer existed. But the people, the individuals who had been part of those units, they were still in the organization, and they may have found themselves in legal or in criminal investigations, so they were still in the organization. Criminal investigations continued to that it's still part of their mandate to investigate tax fraud relating to the illicit economy, so they did still continue. But what I'm trying to explain is that those specialized units, they were no longer there in that specialized, with a specialized mandate. We had generic investigations, and under the generic, things like cigarette smuggling would also fall within that mandate. But previously, like your illicit economy units, they no longer existed in the new operating model. But the people who were part of that unit were still within the organization in other roles.
Do I understand you to be saying that the tobacco task team, which had been set up ostensibly to investigate syndication of tobacco smuggling and so forth, they ended up, as far as you could see, that they were investigating the investigators? Is that what you're saying?
To a large degree, yes.
Sorry. When you were functioning at your prime, who would have referred cases to you?
We received them from everywhere. So our biggest reporters are still internal staff. internally, so the largest number of reporting still comes from tip-offs within the organization. They come from the public, from even other law enforcement agencies who would be investigating something and then pick up that there's a link to SARS, that there's an internal person. So from all over.
So after all these changes, what changed on who reported to you?
Well, for one, as I said, staff, the types of cases that we were getting internally were not your serious crime. There was even a perception that the anti-corruption capability no longer existed. I thought that our name might have had something to do with it, that it confused people and they thought there was no longer such a capability. But also after all the media coverage about anti-corruption and connecting us to a rogue unit, there was also, I think, a break in trust, so all these things, together with the fact that there was the bigger anti-corruption and security capability was no longer there. We were just a small component still conducting investigations.
And when you were operating at your prime, when cases were reported to you, who did you then, after your investigation, who did you then refer the outcome of your investigation to?
All our matters go to, if we find merit to the allegations, then they go to employee relations space for a disciplinary to be initiated. Where the allegations are severe and there's a legal requirement to report to the police, we also would register cases with the police and follow a criminal process, as we did with the procurement fraud matter that I referred to earlier. So obviously, if you're working with syndicated crime, you would have more criminal cases. You would have more cases in court. But when you're not working syndicated crime, there's less of a reason to go and open a criminal case.
After these changes, who did you report, to whom did you report cases where you found there was merit, that there were problems?
We still follow the disciplinary process. It's still within still to employee relations.
I'm just trying to understand, ordinarily, since during the review of the work which was done by this team which conducted investigations into tobacco smuggling, is that they mainly investigated SARS employees who were conducting those actual investigations. Why do you think they had a straight reporting line, or they were based in the office of the commissioner in the first place, as opposed to reporting within your structure in ACAS, because they were basically doing what you were doing?
I can't answer for what was the reason for creating them. I think those who decided that they needed this specialized, if you want to call it specialized, I wouldn't, capability, are the ones who would have to explain why. So Shlengani Matebula, who is the chief officer who signed off on the setting up of that structure, I think he's best placed to answer that question.
Okay.
And if I may say, we have the series of internal memoranda that led to the establishment, that motivated for and led to the establishment of the Tobacco Task Team, which I was planning to put before Mr. Matebula this afternoon. That's why it was called this afternoon. So we can do that at a later point, or I can put those memos in any event. The memo that you recently sent about the Tobacco Task Team, if I may comment, the cases that you listed in that memo that tobacco task team had initiated and investigated over its life, as I recall, there is not one case directed at a player in the illicit tobacco industry. Is that right?
That's right.
So the name Tobacco Task Team appears to be a misnomer. It was entirely directed at SARS staff, some of whom were never involved in tobacco.
That's correct.
And you recommended that Tobacco Task Team be closed down,
Yes.
and the acting commissioner agreed to that.
Yes.
Help me, I want to come back perhaps to a question I may have asked. The tobacco task team, we now know from your testimony that, we now hear from your testimony that it investigated no tobacco-related matters. Who was investigating tobacco-related matters, if there was anyone?
I don't actually know. If the only people or the only unit who had the mandate then in the new operating model would be criminal investigations. So, and their mandate was more generic. In other words, they would investigate all tax fraud. So there was no specific dedicated project team to such an investigation. I'm only mentioning criminal investigations as a case may have come to them, but because I'm not within criminal investigations, I don't know if there were any cases that they, at that stage, were then investigating.
Well, the evidence we've had from criminal investigators here last time and elsewhere is that nobody was investigating the illicit tobacco industry. The tobacco task team was set up to do that, but we now know it didn't do that, and no one else was doing it. That's the evidence we have thus far, is that there's been no investigation into illicit tobacco since early 2015.
They would know better. Okay, so we were informed that we're going to be co-located with the tobacco task team, or they are going to be co-located with us. So they moved in to an office, which was the former group executive of the Anti-Corruption and Security Unit's office. They moved in there and they were operating from there. This was November 2016. On the 4th of April 2017, I received a call and later an email from Mandisa Mbekeni, who was the executive that I was reporting to. And she informed me that Gobi Makanya, now from the tobacco task team, had been appointed the acting executive fraud investigations, and that both myself and Yusuf Denat were now reporting to him. And from that point onwards, so with Gobi Makanya being the acting executive fraud investigation, so now we have merged. Then Yegan Mandi became the acting senior manager of the syndicates. So in the new operating model, we had 2 senior managers in investigations, one for regions, one for syndicates. He then took over as the acting senior manager for syndicates. There was something strange in the acting letter that we were sent relating to the acting of Gobi Makanya, in that it stated that he would be the acting executive fraud investigations as from the 23rd of March 2017, but we were only informed of his acting on the 4th of April 2017. So I don't know why the delay in informing us that we actually have a new acting executive. That was the 4th of April. The very next day, my colleague Yusuf Denat was issued with a notice of intent to suspend by Gobi Makanya, which was basically the first day that he was our line manager. He suspended Yusuf Denat. And I just want to say that more than a year later, Yusuf Denat was exonerated on all the charges that were brought against him in that case. So as you can imagine, it was a very difficult time for me personally, because my colleague has been suspended. This is my new line manager. I don't know what is going on. I'm wondering if I'm the next to be suspended, and I don't know what I can be suspended for. So it was really a very difficult, fearful time for me and for our team when that took place. On the 1st of June 2017, the position of the executive, you'll remember that people have been acting in this role now continuously. So the position was advertised now for a second time. It had been advertised within the whole issue of the affected people, when it was ring-fenced to affected people. And I think it had been advertised once before, but it was then again advertised in June, and I applied for the position. And I was informed by recruitment that I had been shortlisted for the position, and I would be interviewed on the 12th of June 2017 by 3 chief officers and recruitment. I was surprised that I'd been shortlisted, not because I don't meet the minimum criteria, but only because I didn't meet the equity requirement of the job, and SARS at that point had become very strict in terms of equity and would only shortlist people who meet the equity requirements of the role. So I wasn't meeting the equity requirements, but I did meet all the other requirements. I was supposed to be interviewed on the 12th of June. On the 6th of June, before the interview, I was informed by email by recruitment that the interviews had been rescheduled to the 7th of August. So it's June. I'm being shortlisted to be interviewed 2 months later, which is really abnormal, not the ordinary. I was surprised. The reason given by recruitment for the 2 months delay in actually interviewing the shortlisted candidates was that we were now going to be interviewed by 4 chief officers and recruitment. So also strange that an executive role, which is, so it's not even a group executive role, it's an executive role, you must be interviewed by 4 chief officers and recruitment for this position, okay? And also strange that you now shortlisted for an interview that's going to take place in 2 months' time. So, to be honest, this is my own thoughts on the whole thing, is that there was a candidate or a preferred candidate already, and this person needed to be prepped for this interview and needed 2 months to be prepped. That's my analysis of the whole thing. And then on the 4th of August, this is like the Friday before my own interview is supposed to take place. And remember, I've been waiting 2 months now to be interviewed. The interviews, I'm informed by recruitment, the interviews are cancelled. So 2 months later, they cancelled. And then I receive an email from recruitment on the 7th of August informing me that we're now, because by then we were now reporting into enforcement. So we had now moved out of the risk division. We are now in enforcement. And that the chief officer enforcement, who was now responsible for us, had requested that the interviews be placed on hold as she needed time to understand the role and the reporting lines properly before she's ready to interview. On the 20th of September, I then received an email, we're now in enforcement, I received an email from recruitment informing me that the position is now going to be re-advertised from scratch because there's just been too long a delay between the previous advert and the actual interviewing. So it's now re-advertised. And if I'm still interested in the position, I should reapply. I have to reapply. I did reapply for the position in September. And then in December 2017, I became aware that candidates were being interviewed that week, the first week of December. Candidates were being interviewed for this executive position of fraud investigations, but I had not received an invite. And I queried this with recruitment because I'd been shortlisted before, and as far as I could see in the new advert, nothing had changed in terms of the minimum requirements, which I still met, except for the equity issue, which I had, for some reason, still gotten shortlisted the previous occasion. But now I was not shortlisted. When I queried it with recruitment, I received a response from recruitment indicating that I did not meet the equity requirements, and that in the previous round of interviews, exceptional approval had been granted to shortlist outside the EE, the equity requirements. But possibly this wasn't the case now. So there had been an exceptional approval in the previous shortlisting, and this time there wasn't one, so I no longer made it to the interviews. When the query was referred to another recruitment officer to confirm whether in fact it was true that this time there was no exceptional approval, and the new recruitment officer never responded to me, never gave me a confirmation, and therefore I was just left with the assumption that in fact there was no exceptional approval this time. On the 3rd of April this year, I was then again asked to act in the position. Still no executive appointed. I don't know what happened with those interviews where I wasn't shortlisted, but I was again asked to act in the position of executive. As I've indicated before, I then started the whole review of the cases by the tobacco task team, try to get all the cases through the case governance process after the fact, so to speak, but at least to be clear from our side that if we get audited, I would be able to explain that when I started acting, these are the actions that I took, and this is the process that we've now followed. I also became aware on the 7th of May 2018, this year, that a benchmarking exercise had been undertaken by Human Capital and Development, or HR, in relation to this executive role. So what I was informed was that Gobi Makanya, who had been acting executive prior, had queried the minimum requirements of the role because apparently he too was not shortlisted in December, and he queried the minimum requirements, and after his complaint or querying of why he wasn't shortlisted, a decision was taken to actually conduct a benchmark to determine whether in fact the minimum requirements of this executive role is the same as that of other executive roles in the organization. So there was some belief that it wasn't the same. And so...
Was it expected to be lower or greater?
Lower. And so they proceeded, HC&D, or Human Capital and Development, proceeded to go and benchmark with the Hawks and SAPs and fraud investigations units in banks, and the outcome of that benchmark exercise was that in fact the minimum requirements were correct, they were on par, and nothing needed to be changed there. I think that's where I want to stop. So subsequently, external candidates, I understand, have been interviewed for the role. I have never been shortlisted for the role. I am still acting in the position.
Have you applied for the position?
Yes, I have applied.
Well, I think perhaps we can ask the chief officer responsible who's testifying later in the week.
Okay.
Just a question from my side, ma'am. Are you aware of the inter-office memorandum that Mr. Gobi Makanya sent to Ms. Carol van Wyk, copied to Mr. Hlengani Matabula on the 24th of October 2016, requesting permission for him to download emails from the SARS server?
Yes, I'm aware.
Judge, in this memorandum, which is curious because on the 24th of October 2016, Mr. Makanya was not yet part of that acting position that he was the position he was put into. He was still in debt management in KwaZulu-Natal. He asks Mr. Matabula for permission to obtain authority in order to download emails of SARS employees and to search SARS' server for emails from identified suspects in corruption in the tobacco industry. Now, I raise it with you because a number of your colleagues are listed here, and presumably their emails were then downloaded because Mr. Matabula approved this request. What's also very curious, I want to ask you about the impact that had on your work. But what's also curious, and what I wanted to ask Mr. Matabula about this memorandum, is it's not only SARS employees who are identified here, but people outside of SARS whose email addresses are also provided, and Mr. Makanya requests permission to download all their emails too. And curiously, they include the then head of the Special Investigation Unit, for example, Mr. Vasoni, and they include someone from the Public Protector's Office. But there were also about 10 people in your space. So I presume that those emails were then accessed and going back many years as far as I can tell. And I wanted to ask you about the impact of that, if any.
For one, so it was put in that request that these people are somehow linked to cigarette smuggling, all these people, and therefore their emails need to be downloaded. And in that list, there are at least 2 managers in our environment. So the impact of that is, one, whistleblowers report cases directly to managers. So, and by saying that, I'm not saying that that certain people should not be investigated. I am not saying that, but I'm merely highlighting some of the risks. That there were whistleblowers' emails where they were reporting matters, okay, to us. And obviously that was then made, that the tobacco task team then had this information. The other thing is, because these members of the tobacco task team, a number of them came from our environment, or they were handpicked or picked from our environment, they now had information that their managers had. So information around bonus payments, increases, even issues, wellness issues relating to colleagues, other staff members, which the managers were privy to, or were only privy to. So you now had members of the tobacco task team who were former members of internal investigations, now having access to information by virtue of having all the emails of, in particular, these two managers, they could now see what whistleblowers were reporting, what information was there relating to their colleagues around wellness issues, etc. And it later emerged that it became a real problem in that one of the whistleblowers had actually reported something relating to one of the Tobacco Task Team members. And he had become aware of the report. And it caused a problem for that manager because the whistleblower was then approached by the Tobacco Task Team member and was under the impression that the manager in our area had actually gone and informed the very suspect that the person had reported, that he had been reported on. So a further breakdown in trust with us. It also later emerged that the same Tobacco Task Team member then used emails that he had access to by virtue of having the whole download to defend himself in a separate matter where he needed to explain his own actions. He then used these emails, which were not sent to him, were between a whistleblower and one of our managers. He then used those emails as attachments to defend himself. So a complete breach of information security, complete breach, and abuse of power as well, in that the actual, you're now using something that you were privy to by virtue of an investigation, which is how it was motivated for when the download was requested. You use that now for your own personal gain, instead of following due process to obtain them.
Did you ever come across that information in your review of the work that had been done by the task team?
I came across you mean the actual emails?
For example, the request that had been made by Mr. Makanya?
I only came across it during an investigation, because obviously, the incident that I just spoke about, where someone used the emails for their own personal purposes, then I became aware of. And that person then needed to be suspended, and there was a full investigation. In the process of that investigation, I became aware of this memo where all these emails had been downloaded.
Mr. Makanya, if you could help me, when did he join the task team on this tobacco task team?
I'm not 100% sure.
When was it established?
It initially started with only certain individuals being transferred to the Office of the Commissioner, and it seems to have grown from there. So I became aware of Gobi Makanya being part of that team only when, or more clearly, when they were co-located with us. That's when I became aware. So the exact time when he joined them, I'm not certain of.
But as I understand from counsel, at the time of this memo requesting the authority to access the server, Mr. Makanya was neither in the tobacco task team nor part of the co-location.
No, he was a debt manager in KwaZulu-Natal. Mr. Kakra, it seems from what we know that the tobacco task team was established in some secrecy. We don't know the exact dates. We have two memos. The first is on the 10th of August 2016, and that is about investigating criminal investigations or initiating criminal investigations against SARS investigators who were later investigated by the tobacco task team. Then on the 1st of September, there's a memorandum which seems to, it asks for resources to set up a unit, a team, including safe houses and things like that. And it would seem that memorandum, which is sent by, both memoranda are sent by Jürgen Mundi to Hlengani Matabula, are aimed at establishing the tobacco task team. And that's towards the middle of 2016. Does that accord with your understanding, ma'am?
Yes, I've seen the two memos, but I think both memos are written by Jürgen Mundi or authored by him and signed off by Hlengani Matabula. So I don't know at which stage Gobi Makanya then joined them.
His name then pops up on the 24th of October 2016 when he's requesting Mr. Matabula's permission, authorization, to download all these emails.
Yes, that's
and
correct.
That's really
Yes.
as far as we know.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
No questions from me.
Just want to go back to the point you've raised around benchmarks concerning both the structure, location, and reporting of this anti-corruption unit that you had. Of course, you had those peer reviews
Yes.
by the DPSA. Who was benchmarked? When you speak about the benchmark, who was included in the benchmark that informed your views around the appropriate location and reporting lines?
The actual benchmark that we used is called the Minimum Anti-Corruption Capability, which was designed by the Department of Public Service and Administration. So they did a full study, and out of their study, they came up with the minimum anti-corruption capability for an anti-corruption capability in a government department. And they have a model which they put forward, which is sort of the best practice model. And it literally, the Anti-Corruption and Security Unit is that model, the one that was designed by the DPSA and put forward. And we actually implemented that model.
Anything more good?
Thank you very much, ma'am.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Judge, can I ask for a short adjournment?
What is the time?
5 to 11.
Shall we have 15 minutes or 20 minutes?
20 minutes, please.
Thank you.
Or 20 past.
Quarter past.
We resume 20 past. Yeah.
This bag is important. It's carrying crown jewels.
People were just treated like objects. Down to apply a short list.
manager fraud investigations in SARS.
You affirm that the evidence you give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? If so, will you say, I do?
I do.
Morning, Mr. Dinath.
Morning.
Mr. Dinath, you sent a submission to the Commission.
Yes.
And I'm really going to ask you to take us through your submission, the story you tell here, with reference to some of the key supporting documents.
Sure. Thank you, Advocate. The submission that I've provided starts on the fact that I think it builds up on what the previous witness had said. I'm the acting senior manager because I've been made a specialist whilst I was on suspension for a year and 3 months, Judge. And I'm going to start speaking about the actual suspension. On the day that Mr. Gobi Makanya was appointed acting executive, one of his first acts was to suspend me.
So that was the 23rd of March.
No, it was on the 5th of April.
Oh, yes, and he was appointed retrospectively.
Retrospectively.
To the 23rd of March.
Yes. The significance of the retrospective dating is that prior to that he was already investigating me. So now we had a person who was investigating me being appointed as my acting executive, as my line manager, and then suspending me. This is very unusual in our process. I'm told that the reason why he was appointed as the acting executive, it was because Ms. Mandisa Mekeni, who was our executive at that time, refused to suspend me. So he was brought in to suspend me.
Can we clarify, you said he'd already started investigating you. Now, was that in his capacity as a member of the tobacco task team? Do you know? It was?
Yes. So that was, because I mentioned in that document, the September document, the August document, excuse me, where they identify people who should be investigated, not for working with the tobacco industry, but just identifying us for our interaction with the tobacco industry. So there was 3 people identified in that document, and I was one of those.
Sorry, which document are you talking about?
The August document, which sets up the rationale for a tobacco task.
Okay, so Judge, that's the memo I mentioned earlier, 10th of August, 2016. It's the memorandum from Yegan Mundi to Hlengani Matabula, and it's called Tactical Intervention Unit Investigations.
Yes.
And it says that the purpose of the memorandum is to provide an informative background into the allegations that the SARS Customs Tactical Intervention Unit acts outside the ambits of the law with the intention of providing an unfair advantage to the specific tobacco manufacturers, so that the tobacco manufacturer will dominate tobacco industry in South Africa. And in short, this memorandum accuses Mr. Dinath, among others, of collaborating with a security company called Forensic Security Services, which is contracted to British American Tobacco South Africa. And the memo says that Mr. Dinath and others collaborate with British American Tobacco to undermine other players in the tobacco industry, and on that basis should be investigated.
Yeah.
So is that what you were being investigated for?
Yes. So, and the memo continues by saying that particular persons were being disadvantaged, and these being Mr. Yusuf Kaji of Amalgamated Tobacco Manufacturers and Mr. Mark Liffman.
Who's not in the tobacco space?
And not that I know of. I think he's in a lot of spaces, but
It also says quite pointedly that...
Sorry, were you in fact investigating these people?
no, not at all, Judge.
So yes, the memorandum says that SARS is intimidating and harassing. Those are the words used. Mr.
Kaji and Mr. Lipman.
Yes, and Mr. Kaji's associate, Mr. Edward Zuma. And because these people, Mr. Dinath and others, are, quote, intimidating and harassing them with the intention of furthering the commercial interests of British American Tobacco, one of the 4 recommendations of this report is that they be investigated.
And that's Mr. Matabula's.
Yes, so it's the author of the memorandum is Jürgen Mundi, acting senior manager, and it is authorized by Mr. Hlengani Matabula, Chief Officer Enforcement.
Okay.
You can continue.
So that's fantastic, Judge, because SARS doesn't do this. We don't operate like this. We receive incidences, it goes through a governance process, it gets evaluated. There are so many different checks and balances in the process, and then thereafter will you set up investigations. This goes against anything. I mean, there was no process for it. So that's the significance.
What goes against everything?
This memorandum citing advantages for some and disadvantages for others, and then asking for investigation against myself and others. It goes against all the governance processes that we have within SARS.
Why, how should it work?
If there were these allegations and they were true, and
well, if there are allegations which you want to investigate,
yeah, they would report it into the system, and there's so many different entry points. Thereafter, it would go through to our case governance process, which would then see which units should look into the actual allegations, and it would then get assigned. And that then ensures that there's no bias. And this is clearly bias.
So our previous witness suggested it should have come to her unit, which is responsible for internal corruption, internal fraud investigation, and that one of the reasons she recommended to the current acting commissioner that this task team be closed down is because it didn't follow due governance processes.
Yeah, so the previous witness and I in the same unit.
So relative to the governance you had, this other unit was rogue, if one is to follow that sense in terms of the governance system that you have.
Yes. So the other inconsistency at the time of my suspension was pointed out, which I had alluded to, was the fact that I was already being investigated by this Njowitz, Mr. Khatla rogue unit, and now I'm being...
Please don't use the word rogue.
No, it's not mine. It's not mine.
He started.
It's not mine.
So when I highlight this to the HR, the human resources and the employee relations persons accompanying Mr. Gobi, they dismiss it. They do not acknowledge it. So they have a role to play, clearly. The allegations, Judge, at the risk of rehashing and being investigated for the 3rd time now on allegations made by Mr. Kaji, were put to me. Because it was Mr. Kaji who had made the allegations to the tobacco task team, and these were the allegations which I was being suspended on. I then clarified that I was already investigated for this, internally as well as externally, when Mr. Kaji opened a case at the police station. In both instances, I was found to be innocent of what he had alleged. And the matter should be then closed. Nonetheless, Mr. Gobi Makanya and the HR and ER dismissed this and continued. Okay. Thereafter, we go to the disciplinary hearing. So I get suspended, and immediately when I'm suspended, Gobi takes over the fraud investigations unit, which is my unit. And they now evolve from tobacco task team, and they emerge now as the fraud investigations unit on the day of my suspension. So transformation is now complete. I'm suspended, and I'm sitting at home for a year and 3 months. In the time, I try and assert my rights together with Solidarity, who represented me very well in this issue. And we took SARS to the CCMA, saying that the suspension is an unlawful suspension, because they weren't providing me with charges. They kept on extending the suspension, and they kept on delaying. Now, for a limited scope case of this, like this, you don't need to suspend. And even if you do suspend, it won't go beyond one suspension. That has been our practice for the 10 years I've been in SARS. So this was unusual. So Solidarity and myself, we go to the CCMA, and this causes concern for SARS. So then
Sorry, could I just ask, is that after the year and a bit that you go to?
It's during the year and a bit. It's during the year and 3 months, yeah. So then eventually they provide me with some charges. The charges in itself are ridiculous. They relate to the Tax Act, they relate to the RICA Act, they do not relate to any policy or procedure that I may or have been in contravention of. They grab at the code of conduct and start reaching into saying my actions are equal to that. Like I said, the risk of being charged again on the same facts, because I have been now found innocent twice. I will just allude to the one charge. The one charge, Judge, was that in 2011, I had met Mr. Kaji, and I failed to produce the SARS ID card. Not the access card, the SARS ID card. Now,
And that is 2011, you said?
yes, in 2011.
This is now, what year is this?
2017.
5 years earlier? 6 years
6 years, yeah. So that is enough to suspend me. Yeah. So the significance of that is that the card, the act was only promulgated in 2012, the Tax Act that gives rise to the card. And the card was only produced in December of 2012. So I didn't have the card in 2011 because it didn't exist in 2011.
So the problem wasn't meeting Mr. Kaji, it was not producing your card when you met Mr. Kaji.
Yes, yes, Judge.
You didn't have a card because there wasn't a card.
It wasn't a card, it didn't exist. And the Act goes further and says that if a person is approached by a SARS official and the SARS official fails to produce the card, all that the person needs to do is assume that you are not a SARS official and not obey your instructions or follow your direction. Now, how this made its way into a charge sheet through the approval of the employee relations system is beyond me, because there's supposed to be checks and balances in that as well.
So what happened at the CCMA?
So at the CCMA, we then paused our action because of them providing these charges, but I'm now saying that these charges were baseless. And it's not only me saying that these charges were baseless, but if we go to the findings of
So you had your disciplinary proceeding.
Yes.
And who
bench,
presided over that?
Advocate James Machecha. And he then says that the investigation was a sham. He then says that there was no legal basis for me to be disciplined on the same allegations. That the employer presented no evidence of any exceptional circumstances to justify the disciplinary action. He says bringing charges of more than 5 years old incident deserves to be dismissed on that basis alone. He says the delay in taking disciplinary action is not only long, but it's also unreasonable. He then says that the investigation was nothing more than a sham designed to legitimize the employer's decision to suspend and ultimately hold me, the employee, before disciplinary hearing to answer allegations that have no substance. He then goes on to highlight some of the difficulty he's having. That the memo that the Advocate Steinberg had alluded to, they got that information from a Twitter account. And the Twitter account is called #EspionageSA. And and Advocate Machecha, the chairperson, says how that investigation turned into a focus on incident involving the employee. Only the investigator and his principals that acted on his investigation report would answer. So it's beyond belief that this could happen. He then goes on.
What is obtained on Twitter?
Evidence against Mr. Dieneth.
So the precursor to the memorandum that the advocate spoke about was some information that was put on Twitter, and then that information was downloaded. It then made its way into that memorandum, and then it identified myself and others to be targeted. Advocate Machecha then continues and says that myself as employee attempted to protect and assert my rights, but to no avail. The worst thing was that I wasn't even interviewed. He said that the employer's conduct is grossly unreasonable and unfair, that it vitiates the employer's decision to take action. He highlights some other issues regarding the irony of events within the hearings and the evidence produced by the employer. And he says that it clearly shows that the employer was clutching at straws. So where we are, Judge, is that we had a Twitter thing. It then led to a memo. Then leads to me being suspended and investigated for a long time. Only after Solidarity intervenes, then do we get these charges, and then these charges are nonsensical. And then we have the hearing in the 1 year and 3 months. And this is, as far as I can see, this is a chastisement of the employer and their actions.
If I may come in here, we took the trouble of trying to work out how much taxpayers' money this hearing cost. As far as we can see, the charges were initiated on SARS's behalf by Mashiana Mudli and Monama attorneys. And the total paid to them, as far as we can see, is $2,418,000. On top of that, there was an independent report investigated regarding the installation of cameras in boardrooms that form part of your charges. That report is almost $219,000. What we don't know is how much the chairperson, Advocate Machecha, was paid. So What we do know is that we're looking at about 3 million rand in this attempt to prosecute Mr. Dinath.
And so what was the result? What happened to SARS afterwards? So you reinstated?
Yes, I was reinstated. I was found not guilty on all charges. It's a very, very high cost. I mean, we have our own internal initiation unit. We don't do this. We don't hire a law firm to initiate on our behalf. We don't do that. SARS has got sufficient lawyers to do this, even if they didn't want to use the initiation, the current initiation unit. So this is very irregular, and at that price, this is wrong.
Please carry on.
Sure. In the process of the hearing,
Well, it may well be, of course, that the charges depends what work they were given to do, of course. So it may well be that the charges are in order, I don't know. But I presume attorneys act because a client instructs them to act.
I would imagine so. The ruling is particularly critical of the way in which the matter was investigated and the way in which it was prosecuted. It says it was a sham.
So, in the course of the hearing, we wanted access to documents. We were told that they were legally privileged, and that was the previous investigation done against me. Why couldn't I get it? They claimed legal privilege. It's unusual. When we asked for my laptop to get documents, my laptop was wiped. There wasn't any information on my laptop. Very unusual. When we asked for access to the witnesses that I would need who had investigated me that time and who managed that investigation, they simply didn't answer. And it's not like you couldn't find those witnesses, because when we had the break, they were outside in the smoking area. So, further to that, I was told not to call anyone, and people were instructed not to call me. And I wasn't allowed to visit any of the SARS offices. So, Judge, you can imagine that it's quite difficult to prepare your defense if you are hamstrung.
Carry on.
Yeah. So this was done by the Tobacco Task Team or Tactical Investigations Unit or Mundi Unit, as different reporters report on it. But I want to highlight that it was formed on the 31st of March 2016, when the Chief Officer Tebogo called me, Chief Officer HR, called me and said that I should transfer Jaeger and Mundi to the office of the Commissioner. Thereafter, I received an email from an HR person where the signatures were already on there of the Commissioner and other people, and that's the Commissioner Moyani. And I had to just put my signature and transfer Jaeger and Mundi with post and budget to the office of the Commissioner. It was later, a few months later, that we received a mail saying we needed to transfer other employees from our unit. And it was at that point, and these forms were already filled in by Hlengani Matabula and HR and others. And my manager was instructed to fill in that form. And he raised this with me. And we found this highly irregular and unusual. So that's when he and I questioned it. When we questioned it, it is that meeting that the first witness spoke about, where Hlengani Matabula called us to a meeting and said that it's the Commissioner's decision to appoint Yegan Mundi and to do this unit. HR people supported that. It had their approval. From there on, we saw that they traveled, did their work, the communications cost center. And this is highly irregular. You are this other unit, and you're now traveling on a communications cost center. That cannot be right. All of us have our budgeting processes. All of us have our expenditure, well perceived, what you think is going to be your expenditure for the year, and you put that forward. For this to happen is unusual. So it's not an approved unit from the new operating model, and it's not a normal project that is in SARS because they have a budget allocated. So there's no governance even on the setting up of it. But it's been set up at a high level. Chief Officer HR supporting it, and senior HR persons, and it's even getting run through the finance budget of a communications cost center. From my investigations in our environment, this is not according to the Public Finance Management Act. From there on, I forget the exact date because my computer was wiped, so you'll understand it's difficult to piece together everything. So I have it back, but it's barely functioning. But my manager and I were approached by the State Security Agency, and they requested a formal meeting. And in that meeting, they informed us that they were busy with an investigation of their own, and in that investigation, they were running intercepts on some.
Well, just hang on a minute. I mean, is the state, what is State Security Agency? Do they know about this? Is this confidential?
In my assessment, the witness can talk about it in general terms. The names of the state security agents are protected.
And what about the work that they do? Isn't that protected? Anyway, have you spoken to the State Security Agency?
No, I haven't.
Well, I think that I'd rather leave the State Security Agency out unless you speak to them and they say, yes, it's fine.
Yes, Judge.
Okay.
So let's not hear any more of the State Security Agency. Let's go back to the rogue unit.
Sure.
And it's not mine.
Carry on.
Yeah. So, moving along, thereafter we see the communication that emerges in the media, previous witness and myself, about the tobacco task team, and it's been labeled a new rogue unit by the media, and they forced them into our space. But this is in response to a letter written then by Commissioner Tom Moyani to Minister Pravin Gordhan. And in there he tries to explain, this Commissioner Moyani, to the Minister, that this unit is doing internal investigations and criminal investigations and audits and such. Now, and that's the whole of SARS. This unit is doing the whole of SARS because they're doing everything. All units have a legal mandate. Before we start doing our work, we must have a legal mandate. You cannot work outside your legal mandate. So that was the reason why I objected, together with the former witness, as to why they should not be co-located with us, because this is not legal. It's not proper. And we knew it was a problem. I even raised it with Mandisa and Zanele, who had come, and said, we had to testify at the Sikakane Commission on rogue stories before. And now this, no, we're not comfortable. But the unit continued.
Please help me just understand, Mr. Dennett. 31st of March 2016, you get the communication from the Chief Officer HR. Is that written communication?
No, he calls me.
He calls you.
And then it's followed up with an email and a pre-signed document which manages the transfer of posts and individuals. So it's a legal document.
So that written communication that follows states expressly you're transferring, for example, Mr. Yegen Mundi
Yes,
to the office of the commissioner
yes,
with the post and budget.
yes,
That's in writing.
yes,
Have you got that document?
yes.
Is it amongst us? Yes.
Were all the other officials who were subsequently transferred, also transferred with post and budget?
Yes.
How many of them?
So it was 3.
Okay.
So my story is not as long because then I get suspended. All the funny things happen within the investigation. But eventually get the outcome and I'm reinstated. As soon as I get back, Judge, we start receiving calls from people saying that they were targeted by this unit. And we find that these cases weren't registered. And at some point, they were calling themselves fraud investigations, tobacco project. So they changed form at different times. Needless to say, when I got back, and I go back to my acting now, is I was asked now to take up a position within the unit. So the internal investigations unit had myself as the senior manager, and I had 2 managers reporting to me. And these managers had 24 investigators reporting into each of them. It's not according to a SARS standard, because we had grown over time. So taking the initiative, we contacted Bain, it's this manager, myself, and we asked for the elevation of our posts. So my post becomes an executive post, and the manager post becomes senior manager post, and we introduce managers underneath the senior managers, so that we can bring in, so we can have the staff then reporting them, because we have staff around the whole country focusing on geographic as well as thematic challenges that we may have. So when I get back and I'm asked to choose a post, I said, no, look, my post was elevated. And yes, I did apply because you made me apply, but I should have never been forced to apply, because I should have never been an affected person, because affected persons were only those persons whose jobs changed by 25%, the job content changed by 25% or more. Now I know it didn't change because I drafted it. Together with my manager, we drafted it. So we didn't change it. It was the same job, we just elevated it so that we could have a better span of control. But this wasn't entertained. And I then went to meet with the chief officer, Makola. I had never met her before, because she was appointed during the time when I was suspended. And she took over the function of the unit, I think in November of 2017. I spent a long time explaining my 10-year history in SARS and setting up of the unit and all the good that we achieved, and address some of the concerns that they had right now and how we could turn it around within a short period of time. I was made aware also that she was briefed about me by my manager that I was in suspension and this is the case and this is how silly these charges are, and it was investigated, so no need. But yeah, so she did confirm that as well. So when she then said, what is the bottom line? I said, the bottom line is, you know, we need to fix up my post and fix up the posts of my management team so that we correct now and start moving forward. I was then told, no, you must choose one of the other posts. I said, you know, I just come from the Nugent inquiry, and people were complaining about this exact same thing, that when the new operating model was there, they were told, you choose one of these posts or there was a broken line. And we never knew where the broken line was. Because even when I attended the presentation here for the new operating model, all we saw it was a broken line, and it went off the screen. Now I find out that that broken line led to the unceremonious departure of my colleagues like Tshebeletso and Hope Mashilo. That they were kicked out. Their jobs were taken from them, and they were told to leave within 24 hours.
Could I just ask, Mara, if you want?
I think you should finish this aspect of the story. Perhaps you should talk about how your chief officer handled this.
So my chief officer said, look, you must choose either one of the posts, or if not, get out. So, excuse me, I mean, I've been away for a year and 3 months. I didn't know this is the decorum, but I don't think that's fair. And he says, no, get out. And now shouting at me to get out. So I said, you know, you don't care. You don't care that I'm going to speak to Solidarity and we're going to take it, we won, you know, I mean, a particular litigious frame of mind, we're going to win again. So, and no, she just shouted at me to get out. After 1 year and 3 months, the trauma of that, the trauma that you go through wondering what next, the trauma I went through, the trauma my family went through.
Professor Katz, you had a question?
Sorry, if I may. All these things taking place, all these changes, everything that you've told us, that the previous witness, where was that driven from? Where were those decisions taken? What was the purpose of all of this?
So the purpose was, and if I can even jump onto a question that you had asked the previous witness, was to target some of us who were, like for example, the people investigating cigarettes. Who were investigating the cigarette industry were being targeted. I was being targeted because they needed to take over this post and control investigations. This was SARS capture, Prof.
Who was driving it?
So it was driven by the Commissioner Tom Moyani. It was supported by the chief officers. Hlengani Matebula's name is all over that. And by employee relations by Luther Labello, was the main designer and the main spokesperson for the new operating model. And he was the super person in SARS because he was on TV and communications and suspending and part of text discussions and. So it was driven at that very top. And the thing is, to fix it, you can't fix it whilst they are here. You can't fix it with them. And it's not just about fixing the structure, about throwing blocks and doing that. We got to fix the people. We all came from outside and we were employed here. We competed, we got our jobs, and then we were made, now I'm a specialist.
Are you also a specialist, you mean?
Apparently I am. I've been made a specialist. I found out on my day back when I was told to choose a post. How can I choose a post if I have a post? And if I don't have a post.
So as of now, as of now, how is it all functioning?
So I'm acting in half of my previous structure. The reason they couldn't fill the executive post is that every time they tried to do that, Solidarity intervened and wrote a letter threatening to indict them on the filling of, because we want that action finalized. We have placed it formally in the grievance process, and if that doesn't go well, we'll be at the CCMA, I'm sure. So,
are you suggesting that you're acting in the post you held prior to your suspension?
so prior.
Forget about the fact that it later got promoted into rather an executive level, but is it still the same post that you held prior to suspension?
Prior to my suspension, I was the senior manager responsible for overall anti-corruption investigations. Thereafter, there was this new operating model. We were supposed to be phase 3. So when that was supposed to have happened, it was stalled, as we hear. There was a letter sent saying freeze and hold. And so when I get back, they're now implementing the structure. Actually, they implemented the structure when Gobi was appointed acting executive.
I'm trying to understand, you made reference to positions that were affected were the ones that had changed 25% and more.
Yes.
You suggested that your position had not changed 25% or more.
Yes.
Were you shown anything that suggested that in fact you were wrong?
No, they can't, because I designed it. I have the mails in here which we sent through to the advocate, which will show you, where Bain asked me for the design. I then provide the design. They then come back to me and ask me to place the people in the structure. I place the people in the structure, and then they say, thank you, well done, good job.
What was Bain's response to your request for them to elevate the positions within your structure?
They agreed. They agreed.
Was it done?
No, they just agreed. They said they agree on the elevation, but they wasn't done.
Are you suggesting that Bain had a role to play in determining the sizes of the positions? I mean, if you say you had to put up this design which placed the position at executive level, did Bain have a role in that? Was that supposed to go to Bain, or was that something that was determined by SARS itself?
So no, Bain was determining that. So, because I know that some posts which were executives were then reduced to a senior, lowered to a senior manager, and Bain did it. But Bain did it together with that design team of Luther Labello, Ronald Makomva, and others. So they were doing, I don't know who exactly, because it was shrouded in secrecy. Even when they showed us the structure, we weren't allowed to have copies, and we weren't allowed to take pictures of it. And it was in this very room that we were then seeing, you know, which posts are being elevated and which were being reduced. And they then took, for example, wellness, and they put it under employee relations. Now, it can never work. It's wrong. Wellness is supposed to be the well-being, and employee relations is supposed to be the discipline of employees. So how do you put the two together? It doesn't make sense. So there were so many such things, and when we asked questions, we were really shot down. It actually became a little bit of a screaming match between some of us and the design team here in this very meeting. So yeah, it was very, very wrong.
But are you in an acting post at the moment?
Yes, I'm acting for half of the structure. So remember the executive post?
Just 1 minute. To what extent does your present acting position compare to the position you had before your suspension?
I'm doing half of what I used to do.
And sorry, if I may, the other half?
The other half, they appointed a senior manager whilst I wasn't here. So somebody was appointed. And we saw the witness before acting in the executive post. But just to say, you know, the story was that the new operating model was going to reduce the number of executives and group executives and some sort of rationalization. And it did do that, but by I think about 2 or 3 people being reduced from officers getting executives in. These are executives who need the term. But that and then it doesn't stop there. Then we ask for positions. Hey, you know, we need some posts in our areas, in our environments. We need manager posts. We need investigator posts. Now there isn't any, but then the chief officers start getting bodyguards. Each of them gets 2, and even Luther Labello gets 2. So if we want to do a good study, I think it would be to see how far they strayed from their plan.
From the Bain operating model, you mean?
Yeah, yeah.
2 questions. The memorandum of 26 October 2016, in which Mr. Makanya asks Mr. Matabula for permission to download emails from the server. One of the email addresses given was yours.
Yes.
Were your emails downloaded?
As far as I know, yes.
And do you know what the impact of that was?
So it's catastrophic. I mean, every whistleblower, every complainant, every person who's reported anything, their details, their information, and what they reported is on my laptop. I don't travel with my laptop. I don't take it anywhere because it's at risk. So downloading it is very serious. I do believe that Ms. Ronelle van Wyk was targeted because they saw her mail to me. Her mail to me highlighting a serious transgression in an investigation against Mr. Mundi. And she was there. I really do believe that.
Just to say, Ronelle van Wyk, who's testifying on Friday, was a criminal investigator in SARS. And she had sent you an email regarding Mr. Mundi. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. And I think my concern is that where are these mails? And how many copies were produced? And who has them? And then if there's a bias and if there's a collusion, which we need to investigate, Judge, the activities of this unit so that we can see what is the damage done. I'm worried about those people. Every person that has reported to me, I am so worried about them.
Do you understand why people like Mr. Vas Soni, Advocate Soni, and the Public Protector's Office would be named as email addresses that the Tobacco Task Team had to access their emails?
So, no, I don't think they're involved, but I think, well, first of all, it's wrong to put their names on our request, because SARS cannot download the emails of external people. We can only download the emails of our own people. My thinking is that they are on that memorandum because a criminal case was opened by some people. I haven't seen the docket, but I've heard Mr. Gobi Makanya also referred to a criminal case. And
Criminal case against who?
Well, we're already getting to the realm of speculation,
Okay.
aren't we? I think
Yeah.
we should.
so it's just that they would then use that same memorandum to ask the police to do it.
Okay, we can move
We're
on.
not going to hear anything.
Okay.
Just a final question from my side. You returned after a year and 3 months, and you had been investigating, did you say mainly tobacco industry?
No.
Beforehand? No.
No.
You hadn't been involved in the tobacco industry.
So I think the closest we get to the tobacco industry is that there's a lot of smuggling that happens, and I'm just singling out the tobacco industry, but colleagues of mine and I identified that a lot of counterfeit goods, cigarettes, tobacco, alcohol, the illicit stuff, is smuggled through the borders. And SARS employees facilitate that. So that part was, my unit was responsible for identifying the people responsible for that. The checking of the containers after, a SARS person facilitated it was done by Mr. Kumaran Murli, who was also suspended and investigated and lots of charges brought against him. Actually, he was first because he was checking the containers afterwards and doing his thing, seizing the containers and the goods, which is harmful for our environment. And together with that was Mr. Peter Engelbrecht, who was raising the tax liabilities and schedules. So it was like they went after all of us in the value chain. But no, we weren't singling out them. We were focusing on SARS officials facilitating it.
The question I wanted to pose to you was, when you came back and looked at what had happened, had these cases been furthered in the year and 3 months since you had last been there?
So no, the capacity is just gone. I mean, we're now reviving a lot of it now that I'm back. It's 3 months, and we're starting to get things moving again. I think hopefully Mr. Kumar Murli comes back, and he's still willing and able to do that, and we can revive it. And Mr. Peter Engelbrecht, I think we can start, because it's good work. All our work is subject to scrutiny, to audit, to reporting, and you're reminding me now that when we were investigated, a senior manager, if a senior manager is being investigated, there's a duty on SARS to report this to Treasury and to the DPSA, Department of Public Service and Administration. And I know this wasn't done for us because it was never meant to come out.
I have no more questions.
I need to just help me. You had this meeting in 2011 with Mr. Kaji. What was it about, and who had sought it?
Okay, so Mr. Kaji had made a statement in a customs meeting that that he had information on corrupt officials. This was reported to our unit. I allocated an investigator to get Mr. Kaji's version. He then requested to meet with senior people, he said, because he was concerned that it was at a higher level. And then that is how we then set up that meeting. So.
The next question I wanted to ask, you made reference earlier around the time of the appointment of Mr. Makanya, 5 April 2017, and your suspension. to whom did you report at that time, prior to Mr. Makhanya coming on board and you being suspended?
So I reported to the executive in the chief officer's, Hlengani Matebula's office, which is Mandisa Mbekeni.
Or is that the reason why you're suggesting that? What's the basis of your suggestion that she did not want to suspend you and hence Mr. Makhanya was brought in?
I was told this now, recently. When I got back, I was told this. She confided in a person who then came to come and tell me this.
Who told you that? Was that Ms. Mbegeni or somebody else?
Somebody else.
Can I just repeat, it was in relation to this witness that the person came to us yesterday and asked you to put certain allegations to him, to which my response is it would be unethical to do so, and I'm sure you wouldn't have done it, but I certainly wouldn't have allowed you to do it.
Mr. Denath, I'll just go back to a very sore point that you mentioned. Just for clarity, when your chief officer said you must either choose one of the two positions available or get out, did she mean get out of her office or get out of SARS? What was your understanding?
My understanding was to get out of the office.
Okay.
Thank you very much indeed. Sorry?
Judge, I think I did sit in one or two events when you ask people, well, how should we fix it? If I may.
Well,
have
it's
2
getting
seconds.
very difficult to answer that question. But if you do have a view, it would be very welcome.
Please. Judge, I think we have an integrity office in SARS. I think if we have the likes of Tsebeletso back, it's so important that when structures are created or large procurement is done, the integrity office must sign off on such things. I think there is value in considering such an option. I'm not going to go into it more. The anti-corruption office weakness was that, unlike internal audit, we don't have an external body that we can report to. And so South Africa, I know you can't suggest it, but maybe you can, that South Africa needs a national anti-corruption office, and we should be able to plug into that, so that when we have these types of abuses, at least there's somewhere for us to go. I repeat that, to fix the structures is one thing. To fix the people, it's going to take a long time, but we need to have it. And the people who did it, the people who participated and who assisted, cannot do it. I'm not saying they were. When it's difficult to do the right thing, rather do nothing than do the wrong thing. That's all I'm saying. So they can't fix it. We need to have people come in here and fix it. SARS is a great organization and it's important. Thank you.
Sorry, I just have one question I forgot to ask. Do you know who deleted your computer?
No.
Who wiped out your computer?
No, I've requested an investigation into the entire investigation against me. I've requested it formally. Solidarity is where they're on board. That we want an investigation into the conduct of everyone in the whole process, as well as ER in the process, as well as the costs of this 2 million, over 2 million. It's all these unusual things needs to be investigated, because this is not how we've been doing things for the past 10 years. So, yeah.
Just a minute. Just give me a moment. Ms. Steinberg, there are 3 people who have been mentioned here who are on your list to give evidence. Can you make sure that they get a copy of the record of this evidence before they give evidence? I think it's Ms. Makolo, Mr. Matebula, and Mr. Labella.
I'll do so, Judge.
I'm sure that they're fairly quick giving the records. Will you just make sure they get, and I think the other gentleman, Makanya, is it?
Gobi Makanya.
He should get a copy of this record as well to give him a chance to hear what has been said.
I'll make sure, Judge.
And so Mr. Matebula, you say, has told you yesterday afternoon he won't be here. Is there any indication of when he wishes to be here again?
No, there isn't, Judge.
So we'll, okay. So there are no further witnesses today then?
No.
And so what time do we do? Do we adjourn till 9 o'clock tomorrow morning?
At 10 o'clock tomorrow
10
morning.
o'clock tomorrow morning. Good. Thank you very much. Thank you very much
Thank
for your evidence.
Thank you.